My article that I chose was written by Jenkins in 2019. Individuals with more severe depression fail to sustain nucleus accumbens activity to preferred music over time. So the hypothesis and objective section starts out with some fundamental pieces of information. Major depressive disorder individuals have impaired reward circuitry. The nucleus accumbens in the ventral striatum has been correlated with anhedonia. Anhedonia is the reduced pleasure response to activities and stimuli that you previously had enjoyed and received pleasure stimuli from. Those with major depressive disorder have an inability to sustain the ventral striatum and its related other pathways, specifically the nucleus accumbens, most relevant to the study, have an inability to sustain it during activity during pleasurable stimuli. And pleasant music activates the mesolimbic reward pathways. So all the things that all of the nucleus accumbens in the ventral striatum as well. So from these findings, they created a few hypotheses in their study. So compared to healthy control participants, major depressive disorder participants would show less activation in reward pathways when listening to preferred music rather than neutral music, such as the white noise that they would use in the method section. Hypothesis 2 was that those with major depressive disorder would experience greater activation of reward structures in first half of the experiment. So that's like an inability to sustain their reward pathways, right? So they can't keep it going for as long. And hypothesis 3, greater anhedonia and depression severity scores would predict nucleus accumbens activity. Now, what that I miswrote that. It's actually greater anhedonia. Greater anhedonia predicts nucleus accumbens activity better than depression severity scores. And I didn't. That's what they're hypothesizing, and I didn't put that into the thing. But basically, their objective was to explore the neural networks that are correlated with reward responses to music and anhedonia, right? Just trying to get a better understanding of major depressive disorder, its connection to reward pathway inability or inhibition, and anhedonia in general. So the methods were, so here's the methods. 22 male participants, ages 18 to 45, were selected. 12 were chosen for their diagnosis of MDD, major depressive disorder, and the other 10 called healthy controls for their clean history of mental illness. They completed various scales and measures to, obviously the SCID one is for, notes. Basically that proves whether they do or do not have major depressive disorder. The music sensitivity questionnaire, essentially whether they like music. So those are two important things because that's what they're trying to study. The SHAPS, is essentially about that measures anhedonia. The Hamilton depressive scale measures the severity of depression. And essentially, they had 8 clips of classical music. They chose classical music as the pleasurable music stimuli, and they chose 8 90-second clips of these particular music tracks, right? So they made 90-second clips. And then they had 8 neutral noise clips, which were chosen as control sounds to act as a baseline and control. On day 1, participants completed the SCID and then music sensitivity questionnaire to see what music they like, if they liked music, and then if they had depressive disorder or not. And they rated the 8 clips of classical music, and their 4 favorite were chosen for the experiment. So then they underwent fMRI on day 2. So basically they listened to their 4 favorite classical tracks and the 4 noise clips. And these clips were played in a randomly assigned order. And each clip, some total 8 of them were played twice. So, and participants basically completed cognitive and emotional tasks while listening. And this is just the method section talking about the fMRI measurement and data analysis, right? Because they used fMRI programs to capture data, and then data analysis programs and specific strategies and methods to gain all that. It's not totally important for specifically this critique at the moment, but I wanted to include it just for those watching to show that this is just the stuff that they used. But otherwise, it's not overly important to know for the majority of the study. But the one thing that I did find interesting was the two spherical ROIs that were placed in the nucleus accumbens in each hemisphere, right? So this is saying that they're measuring both the left and the right nucleus accumbens. So I thought that was important for the results that are about to come up, just to mention the fact that that was part of the methods. So the results showed, this is the figure 1. It basically showed the difference between nucleus accumbens activity. So as you can see in the healthy control group, when listening to music, their nucleus accumbens signal is, well, that it's very high compared to the major depressive disorder, and that's where it gets interesting. Their left nucleus accumbens is drastically reduced. Their right nucleus accumbens actually is showing a little bit more activation than the healthy control group, but more importantly, their left nucleus accumbens is deactivated. It shows a drastic lack of activation signal when listening to pleasurable music that they had actually preferred and liked before. And so that was their first, that basically sort of provides evidence to support their first hypothesis. This one supports the figure 2 supports their second hypothesis that anhedonia is connected with, or those with major depressive disorders have an inability to sustain their reward systems over time. So it's not even just about that they have a disinhibition of their reward system. It's that they can't sustain it for long periods of time. Right, so they said the first part of the experiment they would see greater activation, and this part pertaining to the second half of the experiment shows just that in relation to their second hypothesis. They have a drastic reduction over time of their nucleus accumbens signal. So they're not. It just gets lower and lower and lower as the time course goes on. So I thought that was very interesting. So the discussion basically just talks about how the evidence of the study provides support for their first two hypotheses. Reduced activity in the nucleus accumbens when listening to preferred music is elicited in people with anhedonia and major depressive disorder, and they hypothesized activation would decline substantially as experiment progressed because of inability to sustain reward systems. Right. So that's what sort of proves or provides evidence in support of their two hypotheses. However, the third hypothesis, the fact that was not there wasn't evidence to suggest that was actually the case, that anhedonia scores would predict nucleus accumbens activity better than depression severity. In fact, the SHAPS score for predicting anhedonia was actually less accurate than the HAM-D scale, which predicts the severity of the scale. HAM-D score was better at predicting nucleus accumbens activation than the SHAPS scale, which measures anhedonia. So their third hypothesis was not actually supported. So the weaknesses I found interesting. Two of them were in the study already, and one of them I found to be interesting myself. So small sample size, which is an increased risk of type 2 error. They only had 22 participants, which isn't a lot. White noise clips may not have been best control, right? They mentioned something about they used other clips that had a little bit more valence to it, but they wanted to just keep it neutral, but they felt like that may not have been the best control anyway. And then cognitive emotional tests during capturing of data during the fMRI phase, I felt like that had a potential to introduce a confounding variable, because with cognitive and emotional tasks, there's a tendency as you're doing a task for it to distract you and not produce any type of emotion, which is what they're trying to measure with the song, right, and the reward systems. And there's also a potential for it to make you a little bit more fatigued, or even put you in a worse, more reduced emotional state over time. So I felt like that was just a confounding that could have been a confounding variable. So the data that they have may not be valid, just because of this one thing, or at least some of their data anyway. The strengths, though, I thought were significant. It locates the immediate structures involved with reward inhibition in MDD subjects. And it discovered that increased anhedonia in MDD correlates with an inability to sustain reward pathways. So, and I think that those two things are very significant, because it's like it just shows that sort of the process, the mechanisms involved, and kind of how they're wounded, if you will, in major depressive disorders. And also that music is a good way to probe reward networks, and in this case, that's the nucleus accumbens. So there's a lot of good strengths in this one, to this study. Now, the follow-up study is pretty simple. Obviously, larger samples would reduce type 1 error and type 2 error that could occur. And in this follow-up study, I would actually remove the emotional and cognitive tasks during fMRI procedure just at the baseline, just at the very least to confirm whether or not this particular element provided some form of confounding variable, right? Just to rule it out as as confounding the data. And the anticipated results, obviously, I just stated, obviously, it would remove a confounding variable, therefore potentially providing a more robust set of data. And I think that speaks for itself. And the importance of the research. So by locating the source of the potential causes of anhedonia in MDD subjects, and just in general the potential problems involved, the potential mechanisms involved, and the weaknesses in those mechanisms in major depressive disorder, the researchers have provided a potentially profound set of insight into creating treatments and perspectives to correct major depressive disorder. So that stood out to me as the most important and significant element for the validity and relevance of this particular study. So I found it to be actually really interesting, because now that they essentially give us a broader, or rather a more specific and clearer target of what we should aim for when we're trying to address major depressive disorder, creating treatments, or even just viewing it and talking about it, right? Because now we can talk about specifically a more fine, precise definition of where it's happening and potentially why it might be happening. And here's my references. A lot of references here. So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed my presentation here, and I hope you have a very blessed Christmas. May God bless us all.